Tonight, the ceasefire seems to hold, but the crisis is far from over. President Donald Trump extends the truce with Iran, giving diplomacy more time, even as military threats remain on the table. Talks are underway, but positions remain far apart. With oil prices climbing and tensions simmering across the region, the stakes could not be higher. Tonight, we examine whether this extension brings the region closer to stability or simply delays a return to confrontation. These questions and more are put to my panel on All 24 News Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's special. And before we bring in our guests, let's follow the latest. The Pakistan brokered ceasefire of April 8th has been extended. Immediate collapse averted. Yet, the core questions remain unanswered. So let's follow this report by Yassine Rikti to get more insights.
Global tensions has shifted to Islamabad, where high-stakes diplomacy is underway amid rising tensions between the United States and Iran. In a significant development, US President Donald Trump announced on Tuesday an extension of the current ceasefire, citing the need to allow time for Tehran to present a formal proposal and for negotiations to progress. Washington has already dispatched a delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, carrying a firm position from the White House. U.S. demands reportedly include a complete halt to Iran's nuclear program, the dismantling of its missile capabilities, and an end to its strategic influence over the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials have rejected these conditions, describing them as equivalent to capitulation. Tehran's participation in the talks remains uncertain. While Iranian leaders reject negotiations conducted under pressure, they have signaled openness to dialogue as a means of avoiding further escalation. Analysts say this reflects a calculated effort to maintain leverage while managing mounting external pressure. With Pakistani mediators intensifying back-channel diplomacy, the outcome remains unclear. Observers warn that failure could push the region closer to a dangerous tipping point.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining me tonight is Dr. Anas Takriti, founder and CEO of the Cordoba Foundation, a political or geopolitical analyst from London. Hello there, Dr. Anas Takriti. Good to see you.
Hello, Karim. Thank you very much for having me again. Thank you.
Our pleasure. And also, he's joining us Dr. John Coulter, a geopolitical commentator from Coleraine. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you all.
Thank you indeed. And also, we're joined by Dr. Gonçalo Ribeiro Teles, a consultant and political analyst from Portugal, Lisbon. Thank you, Professor, for agreeing to be with us.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. And we're also joined by Mr. Omar Rahman, a political analyst from the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Hello there, Mr. Omar, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Hello, Karim. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is all ours. All right, let's begin the discussion, and I might ask this question to you first, Dr. Anas Takriti. So we see Donald Trump extending the ceasefire, a move he said he wouldn't make at the beginning. Technically, he keeps blaming Iran's fractured leadership, and he warns the military is ready and bombs will fall if no deal is reached. Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Baghar Ghalibaf, accuses Donald Trump in return of trying to turn the negotiating table into a table of surrender. So from your perspective, is this a general diplomatic process, or has the U.S. naval blockade and the seizure of Iranian vessels turned what should be a negotiation between two equals into what Tehran increasingly views as a coercive ultimatum?
Well, I mean, I think that we've arrived at a very unenviable position, and that is a position where egos come before strategy and strategic objectives. And that's probably the worst position that a conflict such as this could arrive at. Trump doesn't want to seem to be retracting from his earlier positions or statements. And the Iranians, as they said today, refuse to sign on any agreement that might seem to observers as though it has capitulated or it has surrendered on its strategic positions, particularly the positions of strength regarding the Strait of Hormuz as well as the nuclear question. So I think that we are in a very, very difficult position. It gives us a little bit of area to breathe. The fact that the ceasefire seems to be holding for another few days. But the fact of the matter is that the impasse, the problem, particularly in regards with the Strait of Hormuz and the restriction of not only global trade, but also the world's need for energy and petrochemicals is restricted, and that is causing inflation, that is causing a hike in cost of living across an already crisis-ridden Europe as well as North America. And it doesn't bode well for how this might end, because the question is, who will climb down first? And that's never a good place to be in. So the Pakistanis have their work cut out for them. I don't envy them what they're trying to do. And it's very difficult to see how both sides can claim that they have emerged from these talks with face saved, and probably even claiming some sort of victory. Trump will easily claim victory come what may, but at what cost? And when exactly will that be? And to what kind of permanent long-term damage to the global economy as well as global dynamics and strategy will that be?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Anas Takriti. And now let me bring in Dr. John Coulter. Dr. John, how would you read this latest development? We see Trump announcing the extension on Truth Social, but then we haven't seen any, let's say, reaction from Iran, at least not publicly. And Iran's foreign ministry previously actually cited the U.S. violations of lack of seriousness. So how do you read, for example, Iran's silence, and what does it signal about the entire process? Sometimes you have an ultimatum and then it is extended. What is all this?
Well, President Trump is playing a very clever strategical game with the Iranians. Now, let's not forget what the end goal for President Trump is. No nukes for Iran. The big problem that we have with the Iranians is who is running the country. If you take the Revolutionary Guard, a quasi-terrorist organization regarded by many in the West and in the United States, we've got to remember that the only reason, really, that they want a nuclear industry is to bomb Israel off the face of the earth. And anyone who believes any of their propaganda from Iran, that they want it for heating up homes or anything like that, is living in what we call cloud cuckoo land. Now, as for the Iranians, what they're going to have to do is to show that they are a mature political democracy. They've got to come to the talks. It's not about surrender. It's not about capitulation. It's about proving that they are a truly democratic country. Now, if they were able to do that, I know that President Trump has said no nuclear development in Iran, but if we had a regime in control of Iran that was sensible and democratic, then I'm quite sure the West would be more than happy to develop a responsible nuclear program for Iran. But the big suspicion always remains that the only reason Iran wants this is to have a go at Israel.
Okay, Dr. John Coulter, a lot of analysts who view this situation wouldn't actually agree with you with the fact that Iran is trying to, let's say, wipe out Israel from the face of the earth, because we have heard these claims on so many occasions, and it goes back as far as, I don't know, perhaps over than 10 years, when we had the entity claiming that Iran wants, or it is kind of an existential threat for it. But then the pretext of having a nuclear bomb, we have heard it so many times. And then we had the international agency inspection, or international inspection, doing the job there, but then there was no proof that there was such a bomb. And then we come to see this pretext coming to the surface on and on and on. But then, I mean, what's the point?
Well, the big point is that Iran is one of the main backers of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, both regarded by the United Kingdom as a terrorist, or both are terrorist organizations. So it stands to reason that whilst Iran does not have a nuclear bomb or a nuclear capacity at the present minute, that's not to say that if it was to develop that it wouldn't give it to either Hamas or Hezbollah to continue the war, because we've got to see this in the wider Middle Eastern context, and that is the influence of Iran on terrorist organizations like Hamas and like Hezbollah. So I think there is a very real danger here. Yes, from the point of view, Iran may be saying, oh no, we don't have the weapons, but they are still one of the big supporters and suppliers of Hezbollah and Hamas, and we can't get round that. And certainly, after the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel, we can see that there are benefits there for Iran having its neighbours, its terrorist neighbours in Hamas and Hezbollah attacking Israel. And that cannot be underestimated.
So for you, technically, Iran poses a threat to the Zionist entity. No matter what they are saying, they cannot be trusted, and this can cause, let's say, an existential threat to the Zionist entity on the long run or on the short term, doesn't matter. And here, let me bring back Dr. Anas Takriti to comment on what you just said. Dr. Anas Takriti, it's so, let's say, ironic to hear such claims that Iran still possess a nuclear bomb or has the intention, although we have international inspection doing the job every single time, and it proves that they don't have such weapons, while the Zionist entity is the one who possesses a nuclear weapon, and they refuse international inspection. Dr. Anas Takriti, you with me?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with what you just said and disagree with your guest from Ireland. I think that the issue here is that Iran, I mean, the question regarding whether it has the nuclear capacity to actually make it into weapons that could be launched is highly questionable, and is, as you just mentioned, is subject to inspection, whilst Israel continues to deny having a nuclear weapon, whilst it's one of the worst kept secrets in the entire world that it does. And whilst your guest could cite the 7th of October attacks by Hamas on Israel, I find it extraordinary that he omits to mention that over 100,000 civilians were slaughtered in a genocide committed by Israel over the course of the 2.5 years past, and continues until this very day. But regardless of that, I think that the argument that Iran somehow could miraculously convey or transfer any kind of nuclear capacity that it has to either Hezbollah or Hamas is, with all due respect, is ludicrous to say the very least. Transferring such weapons is a very delicate issue, regardless of whether you have to transfer them over many, many borders. But also you need a capacity to launch. You need platforms to launch such weapons. And a handful of countries around the world, including Israel, by the way, only possess those kind of capacities. So, I mean, the nuclear thing is a red herring. This was a vanity project for Trump. Last June in 2025, we were told that the nuclear capacities of Iran were obliterated. In the 12-day war, there was absolutely no call whatsoever for this war to be launched. Once again, I'd repeat that this was a vanity project for Trump to sort of distract from the pressure he was coming under because of the revelations of the Epstein files, as well as various pressures mounted by Benjamin Netanyahu on him and his administration. So this war benefits not a single citizen either in the UK, in Europe, or in America. It does, however, benefit Israel to no ends. This, as Netanyahu himself has said, was his dream for 40 years. And finally, he's gotten his dream. However, the Americans, even the Trump administration, are now realizing that they were bluffed. They were tricked. He told them that it would be an easy thing done in a few days' time, that the Iranian people would rise against their regime, and that they would have their work cut out for them. But if anything, and regardless of whether the heads of the regime were killed in the first hours of the attack, now we're in, we're deep into the 50th day of the war, and Iran is still yet to crumble, as Trump declares every single day. So I think it's something that we need to look at once again.
Thank you indeed. And let me just include Dr. Ribeiro Tales here in the discussion. Dr. Ribeiro Tales, we've heard, let's say, contrasting views when it comes to the very reason why this war was launched, I mean, from the very beginning. And we have seen, for example, Europe refusing to get involved in this war, saying that it was not their war. But then the European Union has just agreed to expand its Iran sanctions framework to include those responsible for blocking the Strait of Hormuz. For example, we have EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas saying the new sanctions list will target individuals and organizations obstructing freedom of navigation. Notably, the EU is not simply following Washington's lead, let's say, it is kind of targeting the blockade itself, regardless of who is responsible. Now, from a European political perspective, what does this signal about Europe's independent stance, and what are the implications for transatlantic relations, according to you?
Yes, good evening. Europe is not in an easy position, naturally. And I think that Europe has member states that kind of were in doubt how to position themselves. And then it had member states that were more vocal and had a strong standpoint since the beginning, like Spain. I think that Europe, we have to turn the question around. Let's imagine for a moment that the European Union and most member states would have been, again, blindsided by this war of Netanyahu's war and Donald Trump's war, and would have said yes to Donald Trump. It would be a lose-lose for Europe, because we look at America's position at the moment, and it's very difficult for Donald Trump to declare victory over anything whatsoever. We know that in the upcoming days, he'll probably try to do that as soon as possible, because he's got himself in a terrible situation where he went into a war and no one can understand why. There's not even one sound reason. I mean, obviously, there was no strict nuclear threat from Iran. You cited well the Atomic Energy Institution. Other organizations in the field said the same. So, I mean, this has been said over the years by Israel, over the last 10, 12 years by Israel, and they never found an American president that was eluded enough to go into this war. And again, I think that Europe is trying to find its independence and strategic autonomy from the U.S., it has to do with this administration, because the true question is that since Donald Trump has been elected, that Europe does not have a true ally in this presidency. This is new for Europe in the past 50 years, but this is the reality. I mean, when you look at the national security document from the American administration a few months ago, it declared the democratic and liberal European Union as an enemy, not as an ally or not as a distant partner or whatever, as an enemy. It said in that document that it wanted to, I wouldn't say destroy, because obviously that's too strong a word, especially when we have wars going on, but that it wanted to interfere in Europe in democratic governments. We saw in Hungary how much the American administration wanted Orban to win. At the moment, we only have one or two, if you want. Let's see how Hungary unfolds. Far-right governments in the 27 European Union member states. And so there's a will from this American administration that the far right wins in Europe, because they know that these will be their true allies in Europe. And this will be a way that it can sort of colonize Europe into American interests in the whole world. But again, looking into this war strategically for Europe, it would have been a terrible mistake to be behind the US, because we look at the Trump administration and even Israel. Israel obviously has its gain in the region with this war, but we look at the American administration, and today the American administration globally is isolated. That's the reality. Trump managed to isolate the American administration and the country in more or less a year, and this comes up with a non-respectable position in the global sphere, with diplomatic tone completely inadequate in all geographies, and with actions that are just completely not only ignorant, but also non-accordingly to international law, that put various countries in difficult situations, not only militarily or in terms of security, but also economically. So, Europe is suffering the consequences of this war economically, but it's not suffering the consequences of this war in a diplomatic and military stance. And that would have been the worst thing that could have happened to Europe and NATO allies if it got into this war, in a war in which it wasn't even consulted. So the whole world would now be talking of a European Union that doesn't exist anymore, that doesn't have its sovereignty, that is not sovereign, that has no sovereignty over its moves in the international sphere. So what I think that Europe is starting to understand is that it should have been more vocal, like Spain, like France after, and even like the UK, which is not in the European Union, because its whole stance in the global sphere comes from this distance from everything that the Trump administration is doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. Now let me include Mr. Omar Rahman. Mr. Omar, since you're in the United States, what are the echoes there? What are you hearing? Of course, there are a lot of reports saying that there is big divide when it comes to this war. It is a war of choice. It was not something strategic. It was miscalculated. The United States is waging a war for the interest or the strategic interest of Israel. These are among many claims that we hear, and we see that Israel is really putting the United States in a very uncomfortable position. It gets embarrassed to a point that any U.S. brokered agreement or U.S. brokered truce is not actually trusted. And we see, for example, Spain saying Israel is applying the same strategy, for example, in Lebanon, in Gaza, buffer zone, demolitions, outposts despite a ceasefire. And the UN also found that the Zionist entity violated the 2024 ceasefire over 10,000 times. So what does this pattern say about the credibility of American brokered truces again? And what message does it send to Tehran? They are saying that Tehran perhaps is not ready to negotiate, but that's not what we're hearing from the reports and the official statements from their leaders there. They say that we are ready to negotiate, but the US is not serious, and we don't have any guarantees.
Thank you, Karim. There are a few questions there. I mean, to start with the popularity of this war inside of the United States. I mean, first of all, it started off deeply unpopular. The American people were broadly against Trump starting another war in the Middle East, which the American people are, facing a sort of exhaustion after multiple decade-long failed wars in the region. And so they broadly oppose this, including Trump. I mean, Trump was elected partly on that basis of being against more foreign wars, for which he criticized his predecessors. But then, in the end, he's sort of betrayed the principles of his MAGA, America First movement by now launching its second war, or its second set of strikes against Iran in the region. And so that has already, again, we're starting from a position in which, at least in the latest polls, 61% of the American people oppose resuming military action against Iran. And so he started this war from a position in which the bulk of the American people were against it, which I think must be unprecedented in the history of American military engagement abroad. And so that's where we're at. And there's also a recognition, which is sort of unprecedented as well, that Israel is responsible for convincing Donald Trump to engage in this war. And I think the American people are much more awake around the amount of influence that Israel exerts over American foreign policy. And the perspective of the American people here is that Israel is doing it, in the wake of Gaza, in the wake of at least 2.5 years of war elsewhere, in order to assert its regional hegemony or its regional dominance. And that Iran didn't pose necessarily a threat to the United States. And I disagreed with your guest earlier, who said that that Iran poses an existential threat of nuclear warfare towards Israel. I don't think that's the reason why Israel fears a nuclear Iran. Iran is not suicidal. Israel has 300 nuclear missiles, and the United States has thousands which it can deploy against Iran. I think Iran has not shown itself to be an irrational actor. It's definitely shown itself to be both rational and even cautious, overly cautious over the past 2.5 years, which led its adversaries, both Israel and the United States, to view it as weak and vulnerable, and led to this type of attack. I think what Israel fears from a nuclear Iran is nuclear parity, because at the moment, Israel is the only nuclear armed state in the region. And nuclear parity would prevent Israel from having that nuclear card over its adversaries. It would prevent it from having the type of escalation dominance that could reach that type of level. And that forces Israel into a conventional war with its neighbors, or a war of attrition that it can't win, because it is ultimately a country of 9 million people, or really 7 million, ethno-religious Jews, facing a country like Iran of 93 million people. And Israel does not have an industrial base to produce the weaponry it needs. So if it's ever cut off, by the United States in terms of providing armaments, then Israel's in deep trouble. And so it doesn't want that kind of conventional or nuclear parity. So that's where it's at the moment. Now, regarding the credibility problem of the United States, I think the violations that you spoke of in Lebanon by the Israelis, 10,000 after the ceasefire in September 2024, and the most recent ones after this current ceasefire, speak to or reinforce, I think, two perceptions of the United States. One, that it can't really control its junior partner in this relationship, that it is unwilling or unable to exercise the tremendous amount of leverage that it holds over the Israelis, and that Israel is the one kind of dictating the terms of this relationship, in particular in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the region, and that even though Trump, again, opposed foreign wars, he was dragged into this one by the Israelis, and the reporting from the New York Times and others bears that out. And then the second perception is that the United States is increasingly not a credible or reliable actor in the region. And there are many reasons for that, especially under Trump. That perception, one being the withdrawal from the JCPOA back in 2015. That was an agreement that a U.S. president signed on to, and the next U.S. president withdrew from that. So how can any government look upon the U.S. after that and say this is a country that's going to stand by its commitments that it's made? Since then, vis-a-vis Iran, the Trump administration has now used negotiations over the nuclear agreement as a smokescreen to carry out or green light an Israeli attack in June 2024, which it eventually joined. And then this war. There were negotiations happening. There were negotiations expected to continue, and then the U.S. and Israel carried out this joint strike against Iran. So there is a real credibility problem that stands at the heart of why negotiations at this particular moment are having such trouble. There's a trust deficit, and it is, agreements are ultimately about compliance, and it's hard to know if the United States is going to stand by its commitments in any future agreement.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Dr. Anas Takriti, if the Zionist entity won't honor the ceasefire that should have included, or actually it did include Lebanon, why should Tehran, on the other hand, honor any kind of commitments on Hormuz or uranium?
Well, I mean, it's a valid question, but there's no question that we are talking about a country that's been under heavy international sanctions for over 4 decades, that is facing the mightiest military machine in the entire world. And that's, in terms of any kind of parity, there is none in this particular battle. And as your former guest said, that Iran, if anything, actually showed restraint, showed rationale, showed common sense in many of its dealings, and it's showing once again that it's more than willing to sit at a negotiation table and engage with negotiations. However, it is also, I think, it's also excused and absolutely understood when Iran says that Israel, in its entire history, absolutely in its entire history, has never, and I say this advisedly, has never, ever, ever abided by any agreement that it has been party to. Never, ever. And I include the Camp David Agreement, I include the Wadi Araba Agreement with Jordan, I include all the UN charters and resolutions. Israel is a serial violator of international law like none other. But it's something that, unfortunately, the global media doesn't really touch upon or mention. And therefore, Iran is absolutely correct in saying that, listen, whatever agreement we reach, we will half expect, in fact, more than half expect Israel to violate it within a matter of hours. And it happened around 2 weeks ago when the world thought that Trump was praising this beautiful agreement and arrangement that they had achieved, whilst Israel just carried on regardless, bombing Lebanon and killing civilians, hundreds of civilians, in fact. So it's a problem, but it's a problem that Iran needs to address in a measured way, because at the same time that it is probably correct in its reservations regarding Israel's restraint, but at the same time, Iran needs a deal. Iran can't carry on either in terms of managing the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, because that will need logistics that, for especially if you're looking on the long term, that Iran simply cannot hold. At the same time, Iran, as I said, it's been under a severe blockade for 4 decades, so it's already a tired and exhausted and fatigued society, and it can't continue without then something happening within Iran that might threaten the stability of the regime itself. So Iran is in need, there is no question, is in need of some sort of outcome. Now, it could have an outcome where it could proclaim or it could announce that it was victorious, particularly if the regime that has been so severely struck over, since June of last year, and again here in series 2 of this particular war. It's severely hit, yet it's still standing. That in itself could be seen as a victory against the mighty United States of America. So I think that Iran does require an outcome. It does want some sort of deal. Its reservations regarding whether the other party will hold are absolutely justified, but I don't think that they can really be choosers where we stand right now.
Mm-hmm. And now let me bring Dr. John Coulter again. Dr. John Coulter, if maybe we disagree, we can agree on one thing, that this war is really costly, and we can refer to oil prices surging just 7.5% on Monday. Brent was near $95. The Strait of Hormuz traffic was broadly halted, and the US has turned back 27 ships. IEA calls it the biggest energy crisis in history. Now, if this madness continues, who do you think bears the heaviest burden, and what does this vulnerability or economic vulnerability say about the inequities of the global economy?
Well, this whole situation could be solved straight away if Iran grew up politically and started to become a sensible democratic nation. I mean, I've heard some of the panelists defend Iran here. What about the way in which the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has treated its own people over the last 48 years? I think it's a very poignant case of Iran needing to look at itself, first of all, and deciding where it's going to go as a nation. It has to get rid of that particular government that is running Iran at the present minute. And I think it's highly likely that hopefully a new regime under the old, similar to the old royal family under the Shah of Persia, could come back. Now, as for the war itself in that region, the region, it's continuing for the simple reason that the European Union hasn't the courage to join President Trump in this. It's too scared because of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. That's the real reason for that aspect of things. And I think as well, they have to, what President Trump is actually scared of at the present minute is the fact of boots on the ground, which is really what is needed. He is looking at the success previously of the war in Kuwait, the war in Iraq, where coalition forces were successful militarily there on boots on the ground. But the big problem still remains that America is still looking over its shoulder at the legacy of Vietnam, where they got a hammering there, and also Afghanistan, where the Taliban are back in control. So if we're going to talk about oil prices and things like that, we've got to go back to what the core of the situation is. Does Iran want to be a truly democratic nation, or does it want to be run by people, quasi-terrorists from the Revolutionary Guard? And that's what it all boils down to.
But Dr. John Coulter, do you think the wisest thing to bring democracy, between two inverted commas, to Iran through boots on the ground and through invading a country and trying to change the regime, do you think this is the wisest thing to do, while the IMF, for example, is slashing 2026 growth forecast to 2.5% and severe scenario, meaning a close call for global recession? Do you think the world is ready for such a thing?
Yes, they are, because the Iranian situation requires not a political sticky plaster, but a major military amputation. We've got to get rid of that regime that runs Iran at the present minute. Then we can sit down with the negotiations. Iran has got to get it through its thick skull politically that America is not pussyfooting around, that Israel is not pussyfooting around. That's the only way that you can talk to that type of regime. I've been a journalist in Ireland for 48 years. I've covered the worst of the conflict known as the Troubles, whenever terrorist organisations were butchering people on a daily basis. So from that point of view, the only way is to bring them to their knees, to bring them to the negotiating table. If they fear that they're going to be brought to their knees, then they'll come to the negotiating table. But that is the threat of boots on the ground is the only way to bring Iran sensibly to the table to agree a deal that will hold. I do agree with the other panelists. I know they don't agree with me on my right-wing outlook on the situation, and I make no apologies for that. But I do agree, yes, one of the sad things of any conflict is that civilians usually pay the price. So the sooner Iran wises up, gets back to the negotiation and puts forward sensible proposals, then the sooner civilians will not be killed.
Okay, Dr. John Coulter. Let me bring Dr. Gonzalo Ribeiro-Telles here with this question. Dr. Gonzalo Ribeiro, if anything, do you think the world is ready to pay the heavy price so as for the USA and the Zionist entity to play the hero and bring democracy to Iran and Iranian people?
No, not at all. And just commenting on some of the things that your former guest said, again, I think that we have to look at our recent past. I mean, when we speak about Iraq and Kuwait as successful endeavors, they were the contrary to that, by any means that you look at it. And you cannot even ask any American this. I mean, I think that the whole talk about regime change and exploiting democracy all over the world, I believed we were past that. I mean, obviously, in my perspective, most people in Europe are not questioning the Iranian regime, are not questioning how rough the Iranian regime is, some of its extremism. But again, that has to do with Iran. We can't go into countries, or we can't bomb countries, or we can't invade countries because of that. We're gone. We're over with those days. We should have thought. I mean, I know that Donald Trump doesn't like history, but this isn't even history. He should look at when the West committed its biggest errors in the last 20 years, and that was the Iraqi war. And let's not talk about Afghanistan, etc. But again. Looking into this, I don't see how Iran is not reinforced with this. I mean, first, it was the whole nuclear bomb threat. We know that was not a reality. Now, the whole regime change, we know that is not going to happen. And that normally again, the worst happens when we proceed that way. And so it's very difficult to not think that Iran will be reinforced. And that's exactly what is happening, because we see that now they're making a toll for all ships that go through the Strait of Hormuz. So they have an economic weapon here, which is very significant and which is very intelligent for them to use. Again, I only see rationality, as was said by another of your former guests before, from Iran. We can say that the regime is this, and this, and with no doubt it is. But it's the rational actor here. It's completely the rational actor here in its response, even with its response in bombing neighbors, which one can say that it's completely unexpected. But it was intelligent, because most of them are allies of the United States. So they'll put this on the United States. And it's a country that naturally is desperate. And again, we have to look at the things in geographical terms also. And again, commenting on some of the things that the guest that was before me said, we can't analyze everything through a Western perspective. In Iran, there's not. I mean, life is seen in a completely different perspective. There's a religious view that in the West is not as dominant. That life is more dispensable. So when you think that you could just put boots on the ground and that the European Union is chickening out, I don't know why. I actually think that the European Union finally, after more than a year, is finally being courageous and seeing Donald Trump for what he is. But you can't expect that the public opinions answer the same way. If Donald Trump is irrational and is doing everything the way he shouldn't do in this aspect, but he knows one thing, is that the day that he puts boots on the ground in Iran, he'll have an even bigger problem, which is the public opinion in the United States, which is majorly against this war, will even be harsher on him. And he knows that because he won't be able to explain why he's putting boots on the ground in Iran. No one. You can't dominate the whole world. That doesn't exist. Regions are different. Realities are completely different. So if you put boots on the ground, again, it would be a long-lasting war. No one knows with what outcomes for the U.S., and the public opinion would destroy him, as it would destroy any European Union country that would put boots on the ground in Iran, and rationally so, completely rationally so. And he would only antagonize even in a greater sphere, the whole toxic vision that everybody already has towards the Trump administration. So again, I think that economically, what he'll try to do is he'll try to leave this as soon as possible. The extended ceasefire is this infinity, as he declared in this last post, this last statement. So again, what the world can expect in Europe economically is that these will be tough times. They will last economically tough times, but Iran will be reinforced, whatever the outcome. I think that's undoubtedly.
Perfect. And since you mentioned the public opinion, let me get back to Mr. Omar Rahman. Mr. Omar Rahman, Pew Research Center finds 59% of Americans say the Iran war was wrong, and 61% disapprove of Trump's handling, and only 27% approve of the strikes. Now, global survey shows 88% believe the war has divided the U.S. from its allies. Now, what does it mean when a president wages war that his own people oppose, and that isolates America globally? How would you see this?
Yes, I sort of commented on that in my first answer, but I think having an unpopular war or being engaged in this with the American people against it reduces or narrows Trump's strategic depth, his ability to sustain a war long term, in the face of a public that's against it. And this is also compounded by the fact that we are in the United States in an election year. So in November, Trump's not running for re-election, but the Congress, the Senate, and the House, will be in an election year, and Trump can lose, his control of both of those houses, and that will be have a huge impact on the remainder of his presidency over the next 2 years. And so there's.
I know you have mentioned this in details, but what I was trying to get at is if we don't have public support, this can affect his election, true. And if the Congress cannot be relied upon to support this war, what kind of endgame scenario are you imagining there?
Yeah, Trump's in a difficult position, and your previous guests were talking about his desire to get out of this. I certainly think he does want to get out of this. At the same time, Trump is an extremely narcissistic human being. Maybe that is his defining characteristic. And I don't think he wants to be seen as the man that lost a war, especially to a country like Iran. And didn't come out of this with any achievements whatsoever, and it was a major strategic failure. And so, I think he's willing to put his own personal interest, vainglorious interests, above the interests of the country. And I think he's going to look for a way to change the dynamics at the negotiation table. we might be in a period, a sustained period of ceasefire in which this is all recalibrated. But I don't think time is on the American side, because I think the pressures on the economy, on the global economy, are only going to grow as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. You know, oil prices are at 95, 105, 115 at this moment, which is serious and the most dramatic rise in the oil price we've seen in history. But I think we're heading towards a much larger cliff as we draw down, as as countries around the world draw down on their strategic reserves, and the barrels in the marketplace become very scarce, and the warnings that are coming out from experts on the energy industry are dire indeed. And so I don't think this is going. The time is again on the U.S.'s side in this war, and so I think we may have to get to a point where the dynamics at the negotiation table change. I think the conditions aren't that ripe. I did agree with your guest, Dr. Takriti, earlier, that the Iranians also need a deal desperately. But again, I don't think they can go and sign an agreement with America that has no guarantees in place, no guarantors, doesn't have the details in place. And again, we discussed the lack of credibility that the United States has when entering this type of talks or entering this type of agreement. And so all those kind of conditions are in place where I think the sides are at a stalemate, and they may have to go back to war to change the dynamics of the negotiation table. I certainly hope, unlike what your guest was advocating in terms of putting boots on the ground, that's not where this is headed. Because first of all, I mean, how many boots on the ground are you going to put that are going to make a decisive change? I think those, a U.S. Army invasion would be a catastrophic mistake for the United States. Iran is a massively much larger country geographically and demographically than Iraq was. All the regime change wars of the past 20, 30, 40 years have been absolute failures, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, whether we're talking about Libya, whether we're talking about Iraq. I mean, Iraq right now has a government that's more aligned with Iran than with the United States. So what was the result of that? What is the result of 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan, but the Taliban replaced with the Taliban? So I think that would be a huge mistake for the United States to put boots on the ground in an attempt at regime change. And so where we ultimately get here, I think Trump is sort of playing for time, but I don't think there are any good options on the table at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That was very clear. Let me bring back Dr. John Coulter to have his opinion on this. Dr. John Coulter, would you agree that the midterm months or the midterm election actually is going to affect Donald Trump, since we are having a lot of polls saying that 61%, for example, disapprove of Trump's handling of the war. The Democrats force weekly war powers votes, and the conservative dissent fractures the GOP. I mean, what does Donald Trump actually need this extended ceasefire to deliver? Maybe substantively or optically to neutralize, let's say, criticism and protect Republican majorities?
Well, let me say straight away in answering the panelists, Donald Trump is one of the best presidents that the United States has ever had, because he speaks the ordinary people's language. He makes it very blunt. At times, maybe it's very spark language, but he tells it as it is. Now, whilst you may point out 61% are against, that still leaves 40%, a significant chunk in support of him. What he needs is a deal from Iran that the Iranians will stick to. It's as simple and clear as that. He also needs as well countries like the United Kingdom to step up to the mark and support it. Now, one of the reasons that basically the United Kingdom is not supporting boots on the ground and is really just using defensive methods for planes and bombs to attack Iran is quite simply there is an election next month in mainland Britain, in which Sir Keir Starmer's leadership is really on the line. And if the opinion polls there in the United Kingdom transfer into actual votes in the ballot box, we can kiss goodbye to Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. So from that point of view, I think that Donald Trump, yes, may take a hit in the polls in the United States in these midterm elections, but that's nothing new for the ruling government, the ruling president, to take a hit like that. What matters most is at least Donald Trump had the courage to see what was happening in Iran, and he made a move. And you can't underestimate that decision, because otherwise then you're back to history repeating itself. We all remember the 1930s, whenever Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler, and within days the whole thing had fallen apart. What this deal mustn't become is another Munich Agreement that falls apart. It must bring stability. And perhaps the threat of boots on the ground may bring the Iranians to their senses to see Trump isn't bluffing, and that it will be a deal that long-term will bring stability.
Mm-hmm. And finally, as we are nearing the end, let me include Dr. Anas Takriti for a final word. Dr. Anas Takriti, Trump did extend the ceasefire, but still told CNBC he didn't really want to, and there is not much time left. So he expects bombing to resume and the blockade continues. Now, if this continues, the Hormuz Straits would definitely remain closed, and oil is going to actually rocket. So what is the most likely scenario, according to you? Diplomatic breakthrough, further extension, or collapse into full-scale war? Dr. Anas Takriti?
I think that it's... I mean, just coming back to Trump, and I find it quite laughable that your guest from Ireland continues to call him the best president the US has had. In any case, I think that regardless of what the polls say, I would suggest that the biggest thing going for Trump, whether it be in the November midterms or whether it be generally in terms of his popularity and his diving popularity for that, is the fact that the Democrats are unclear as to exactly what they stand for. If I was asked to speak intelligently of what the Democrats' main policies in regards with anything, whether it be internal inside the US or on the foreign policy front, I would be challenged to do so. But regardless, in respect to your question, and as I opened, I think that we're in a very unenviable position. And that is that we have egos now dictating negotiations. I mean, we can't negate, I mean, regardless of all the misgivings, I hail from Iraq, and I can speak for hours regarding the crimes committed by the Iranian regime. I'm no fan of the Iranian regime. But to suggest that somehow boots on the ground, and like your former guest from America said, you know, how many? 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 200,000? How many would it take? We'd just be creating another calamity, not only for the Americans, but for Iran. And Iraq, my own country, holds testimony to that. 23 years on, you can't have a worse situation in mind. And Afghanistan is well cited by one of your guests. Again, after years and years and trillions of dollars poured into that country, we've restored power to those whom we claim that we grappled the country out of their grips. So this is absolutely ludicrous. What we have today is a situation where there needs to be an outcome where both sides can claim victory, to be perfectly honest. And Trump, give him something. Give him the Nobel Peace Prize. For God's sake, just someone give him the Nobel Peace Prize. It seems that that is now his lifetime ambition and objective. Just give it to him and save the world from the calamity. In regards with Europe, I mean, your guest says that the United Kingdom needs to stop being scared. Why is the United Kingdom scared? It's scared because Trump changed the whole dynamics of the international world order. In one fell swoop, NATO didn't matter anymore. In one fell swoop, the Ukraine didn't matter anymore. All of a sudden, he was chummy with Russia all over again. And Europe felt that they were in no man's land. They were left destitute to face Russia and Putin with no backing and no guarantee that America would support their stand. So, of course, Europe will say, listen, hang on. If that's the case, then we will look after ourselves. We will care for our interests. And there is nothing that we see in terms of changing the situation in Iran that fits our best interests. I think that we are approaching a time when international world order is in a transformative position. I think that we are in a very, very dangerous situation. The main thing is that this war stops and the world returns to some level and degree of normalcy. Otherwise, we are in a time where we are laying the ground for a change that will require decades and decades for a recalibration, and that is something that I dread even thinking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anas Al-Takriti. Many thanks to all our guests, Dr. Anas Al-Takriti, Dr. John Coulter, Dr. Gonzalo Ribere Telles, and Mr. Omar Rahman. So the guns have paused, the tensions have not yet. And as the ceasefire has been extended, the fundamental questions remain. That was the central core of our special for tonight. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for following. And until next time, have a good one.